I hate her. Lila, a 15-year-old with fury in her eyes, spits the words at Celeste Johnson, her voice echoing in the glass-walled grandeur of Sky Dune retreat. The desert sun bathes the sleek lobby in gold, but the air is thick with tension. Celeste, a black woman exuding unshakable poise, meets Lila's glare with a steady gaze, her fingers tightening briefly on her clutch, betraying a flicker of hurt. This clash of prejudice and power sets the stage for a story of truth unveiled. What fuels Lila's rage? Can Celeste's hidden legacy silence her doubters? Dive into this desert drama with us. Subscribe now for more captivating tales, and share. Where are you watching from? Stay to uncover a revelation that will leave you speechless. The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of amber dunes swallowing the horizon under a merciless sun. Sky Dune retreat rose like a mirage, its glass walls glinting defiantly against the arid expanse. A sleek black SUV carved through the sand, tires humming softly, a faint cloud of dust trailing in its wake. Inside, the air was cool, scented with leather and Celeste Johnson's jasmine perfume. She sat upright, her tailored white linen suit crisp against her deep brown skin. Her hair swept into a sleek chignon that spoke of meticulous control. At 36, Celeste was a vision of power, Hollywood's visionary director, a woman who commanded boardrooms and red carpets with equal ease. Her eyes, hidden behind oversized sunglasses, traced the dunes with a quiet intensity, as if reading secrets in their curves. Beside her, Daniel Ashford, 27, adjusted his cream blazer, his boyish charm softened by a tailored confidence. His hand rested lightly on Celeste's, his thumb brushing her knuckles in a gesture both tender and possessive. The 9-year age gap between them drew no comment in their private world, but here, at the edge of his family's elite circle, it was a silent lightning rod. In the backseat, Lila, his 15-year-old daughter, slouched against the leather, earbuds blasting a sullen rhythm. Her dark hair fell over her face, shielding her from the world, and from Celeste. Her fingers clutched her phone, scrolling aimlessly, her posture a fortress of resentment. The SUV slowed at the retreat's gates, where palm trees framed a marble fountain, its water shimmering like liquid diamonds. A bellhop, young and starched, in a pristine uniform, hesitated as he approached Celeste's door, his eyes flickering with a split-second judgment. Celeste noticed, her lips tightening imperceptibly, but she stepped out with a grace that turned heads. Her heels clicked on the stone path, each step a declaration. Daniel followed, his smile warm but tinged with nervous anticipation. Lila lingered, dragging her feet, her sneakers scuffing the ground as if to mark her reluctance. The lobby was a cathedral of opulence, glass walls soaring to meet a vaulted ceiling, where a chandelier dripped crystals that caught the desert light. Staff moved like shadows, their efficiency polished to invisibility, yet their glances lingered on Celeste a moment too long. She removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes dark and piercing, like polished obsidian. She scanned the room, not with defiance but with a quiet claim to her place. Daniel's hand grazed her lower back, a silent anchor, but Lila's presence behind them was a storm cloud, her earbuds now dangling, her eyes narrowed. Margaret Ashford, Daniel's mother, emerged. From the crowd, her silver hair immaculate, her pastel suit a nod to old money. Her smile was practiced, tight, the kind that welcomed without warmth. "Celeste, Daniel, so glad you made it," she said, her voice smooth as silk but edged with restraint. Her eyes flicked over Celeste, lingering on the tailored suit, the diamond studs glinting at her ears. "And Lila, darling, come here." She extended a hand to her granddaughter, who shuffled forward, avoiding Celeste's gaze. Celeste's smile was warm, deliberate. "Margaret, this place is stunning," she said, her voice rich, carrying the cadence of someone used to being heard. She turned to Lila, softening. "Lila, I heard you love photography. The light here must be incredible for it." Lila's eyes flicked up, sharp and cold. "Whatever," she muttered, loud enough to sting, her arms crossing tightly. The word landed like a pebble in still water, ripples spreading through the lobby. A nearby staff member glanced away, pretending not to hear. Daniel's jaw tightened, his hand pausing on Celeste's back. "Lila," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Let's be polite." His eyes met Celeste's, an apology flickering in them, but she shook her head slightly, her expression serene. She was no stranger to this, judgment cloaked in whispers, assumptions woven into glances. As a black woman who'd clawed her way from a modest upbringing to Hollywood's elite, she'd faced worse than a teenager's barb or a bellhop's hesitation. Yet the weight of it, here in this gilded cage of privilege pressed against her chest. Margaret steered the group toward the check-in desk, her chatter about the retreat's amenities a thin veil over the tension. "The theater dedication is tomorrow," she said, her eyes sliding to Celeste. "Quite the mystery donor, they say." Her tone held a hint of skepticism, as if questioning Celeste's place at such an event. Celeste's fingers tightened briefly on her clutch, but her smile remained, a shield polished to perfection. She'd learned long ago that power wasn't in reacting, it was in enduring, in outlasting. Lila trailed behind, her sneakers squeaking on the marble floor. She pulled out her phone, typing furiously, her thumbs a blur. Celeste caught the motion, her gaze lingering on the girl's hands. There was something in the way Lila gripped her phone, the same way she'd clutched her camera in the car, a tether to something she could control. For a moment, Celeste's eyes softened, seeing not just defiance but a child grappling with change, with loss. She remembered her own teenage years, the sting of being an outsider, the hunger to prove herself. The check-in process was swift, the staff handing over key cards with practiced smiles. But as Celeste reached for hers, the clerk's hand faltered. A microsecond of hesitation that spoke volumes. Celeste's fingers closed around the card, her movements deliberate, her eyes locking onto the clerk's for a fleeting moment. No words were needed. Her gaze was a quiet command, a reminder of her presence. The clerk flushed, mumbling an apology, but Celeste had already turned away, her posture regal. Daniel leaned close, his voice low. "You okay?" he asked, his brow creased with concern. Celeste nodded, her lips curving into a small, private smile. "Always," she said, her voice a soft promise. But her eyes drifted to Lila, who stood apart, her back to them, staring out at the dunes. The girl's shoulders were hunched, her silhouette small against the vastness of the desert. Celeste's heart tightened, not with anger, but with something deeper, a recognition of pain she knew too well. The lobby buzzed with arriving guests, their voices a hum of wealth and privilege. Margaret excused herself to greet an old friend, her departure a subtle dismissal. Celeste stood at the center of it all, her presence a quiet defiance against the whispers, the glances, the assumptions. She was here, not as Daniel's partner, not as an interloper, but as Celeste Johnson, director, visionary, a woman who'd built an empire from nothing. And yet the weight of Lila's whatever lingered, a challenge she couldn't ignore. As the trio moved toward the elevators, Celeste's heels echoed with purpose, each step a reclamation. Daniel's hand found hers again, his touch grounding. Lila trailed behind, her eyes fixed on the floor, but for a fleeting moment, she glanced at Celeste, a flicker of curiosity, quickly buried. The desert sun burned outside, relentless, but inside, a different heat was rising, a collision of prejudice and power, of fear and truth that would soon reshape them all. The grand atrium of Sky Dune retreat shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, their light fracturing into 1,000 prisms that danced across the marble floor. The air hummed with the clink of champagne flutes, the murmur of elite conversation, and the delicate strains of a string quartet weaving through the crowd. Guests in tailored suits and flowing gowns moved like chess pieces in a game of power, their laughter polished, their glances calculated. At the room's edge, a massive stone plaque stood partially veiled, its inscription hidden, a silent promise of the theater dedication to come. The desert night pressed against the glass walls, its vastness a stark contrast to the opulence within. Celeste Johnson stood at the heart of it all, her emerald silk dress catching the light like a beacon. At 36, she was a force, her deep brown skin radiant, her posture a study in quiet command. Her hair, swept into soft waves, framed a face that held both warmth and steel. She laughed with a tech mogul, her voice rich and deliberate, each word a brushstroke painting her as Hollywood's visionary. Her eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the room, not for approval but for understanding, reading the undercurrents of privilege and prejudice that swirled beneath the surface. Daniel Ashford lingered at her side, his cream blazer crisp, his smile boyish yet proud. He watched Celeste with a quiet awe, his hand brushing hers in a gesture of solidarity. But his eyes flickered nervously toward the corner, where his daughter, Lila, stood with Margaret, his mother. Lila, 15, wore a sullen black dress, her arms crossed, her dark hair falling like a curtain over her face. Her fingers toyed with her phone, but her gaze was locked on Celeste, sharp and accusing. Margaret, in a pale lavender gown, leaned close to Lila, whispering about proper company, her words a barbed fence meant to keep Celeste at a distance. Celeste felt the weight of their stares, a familiar pressure she'd carried since her first days in boardrooms dominated by faces that didn't look like hers. She turned, catching Lila's glare, and offered a smile, warm, open, but laced with a challenge. Lila's lips twitched, a smirk forming, and she leaned toward a friend, a blonde girl in a sequined dress. "She's just here for Dad's money," Lila whispered, her voice low but deliberate, carrying just far enough to reach a nearby guest. The woman, a philanthropist in pearls, frowned slightly, her eyes darting to Celeste before looking away. The ripple of Lila's words spread, a subtle poison in the air. Celeste's jaw tightened, a fleeting crack in her composure, but she sipped her champagne, her movements deliberate. Her eyes locked onto Lila's for a moment, calm but piercing, a silent question. "What are you afraid of?" Lila faltered, her smirk fading, but she quickly turned back to her friend, her fingers typing furiously on her phone. Daniel caught the exchange, his brow creasing. He leaned toward Celeste, his voice low. "I'll talk to her," he murmured, his hand grazing her arm. Celeste shook her head slightly, her smile unwavering. "Let her be," she said softly, her tone a blend of patience and resolve. She'd faced worse than a teenager's whispers, years of studio executives dismissing her scripts, of gala guests questioning her place. This was just another stage. Across the room, Evelyn Warwick, a waspish socialite with a penchant for cutting remarks, glided toward Celeste. Her silver gown shimmered, but her smile was sharp, a blade cloaked in courtesy. "Ms. Johnson," she said, her voice syrupy, "your rise in Hollywood is quite unexpected." The words hung, heavy with implication, a jab at Celeste's roots, her race, her audacity to stand among the elite. The mogul beside Celeste shifted, sensing the barb, but Celeste's laugh was light, disarming. "Talent has a way of surprising those who don't look for it," she replied, her eyes holding Evelyn's, a quiet dare. The mogul chuckled, nodding, and Evelyn's smile tightened, her retreat masked by a sip of wine. Margaret watched from the sidelines, her lavender-gloved hand resting on Lila's shoulder, her expression one of practiced neutrality. But her eyes betrayed her, a flicker of approval as Lila whispered again to her friend, spreading the rumor further. A waiter passing by caught the words, his brow furrowing before he moved on, his tray steady but his glance lingering on Celeste. The room, for all its grandeur, was a battlefield of whispers, and Celeste stood at its center, her presence a defiance of every unspoken rule. Daniel's hand found Celeste's again, his thumb tracing her knuckles. "You're incredible," he whispered, his eyes warm but clouded with worry. He glanced at Lila, his jaw tightening, a father torn between love and discipline. Celeste squeezed his hand, her touch grounding. "I've got this," she said, her voice a soft promise. But her eyes drifted to Lila, who now stood alone. Her friend distracted by a passing tray of canapes, Lila's fingers hesitated over her phone, her gaze flicking to Celeste, then away, a crack in her defiance. The quartet shifted to a new melody, its notes rising like a tide, pulling the crowd toward the dance floor. Celeste moved with Daniel, her steps fluid, her smile a shield. But as she passed Lila, their eyes met again, a fleeting clash of fire and steel. Lila's lips parted as if to speak, but she turned away, her shoulders hunching. Celeste's heart tightened, not with anger, but with recognition. She saw herself in Lila's defiance, the girl who'd once fought to be seen, to be heard, in a world that tried to erase her. The plaque at the room's edge loomed, its hidden inscription, a silent pulse beneath the gala's glitter. Celeste's gaze lingered on it, a private knowledge flickering in her eyes. She was more than a guest here, more than Daniel's partner. But for now, she let the whispers swirl, let the glances linger. She'd learned long ago that truth didn't need to shout. It waited, patient and unyielding, for its moment. As the quartet played on, Celeste raised her glass, her smile a quiet vow. This was only the beginning. The desert awoke with a blush of dawn, its amber dunes glowing under a sky streaked with pink and gold. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and the promise of heat to come. Sky Dune Retreat's infinity pool shimmered in the distance, a liquid mirror reflecting the vastness above. Celeste Johnson strode along a narrow trail, her athleisure sleek against her deep brown skin, her hair pulled into a high bun that swayed with each purposeful step. At 36, she was a paradox, Hollywood's titan of storytelling. Yet here, in the raw silence of the desert, she seemed to draw strength from the earth itself. Her eyes, sharp and contemplative, traced the curves of the dunes, as if they held the script to a story only she could read. Daniel Ashford jogged to catch up, his breath puffing in the cool morning air. His cream linen shirt clung lightly to his frame, his boyish grin softening the lines of his 27-year-old face. "You're fast," he panted, falling into step beside her. His hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch that carried the warmth of their shared dreams. Celeste smiled, her gaze softening. "The desert doesn't wait," she said, her voice low, laced with a playful challenge. Behind them, Lila trailed, her sneakers kicking up sand in deliberate defiance. At 15, her sullen posture was a fortress, her dark hair falling over her eyes, her camera dangling from her neck like a reluctant talisman. She kept her distance, her silence louder than words. The trail wound through the dunes, the sand shifting underfoot like a living thing. Celeste paused, her hands on her hips, her gaze sweeping the horizon. "This light," she said almost to herself, "it's perfect for a shot, the way it catches the edges like a painting." Daniel nodded, his eyes bright with admiration. "You see stories everywhere," he said, his voice warm. He turned to Lila, hoping to bridge the gap. "Hey kiddo, isn't this great for your photography?" Lila's eyes flicked up sharp and cold. "It's just sand," she muttered, her tone biting. Not like she'd know anything about it. The words landed like a gust of wind, sharp and unyielding, stirring the quiet morning. Celeste's breath caught, but her face remained serene, a mask honed by years of navigating rooms where she was the only one who looked like her. She turned to Lila, her movements deliberate, and knelt to her level, the sand crunching softly beneath her. "You're right," she said, her voice steady, warm. "I don't know your desert yet, but I know light, shadow, how to frame a moment. Want me to show you?" Her hand extended, an olive branch, her eyes searching Lila's for a flicker of connection. Lila's fingers tightened around her camera, her gaze wavering. For a moment the desert held its breath, the silence heavy with possibility. Then Lila scoffed, her lips curling. "You're just showing off," she snapped, her voice trembling with something deeper than anger. Fear, perhaps, or the ache of a girl who felt her world shifting. She turned on her heel, storming down the trail, her sneakers kicking up clouds of sand. But as she walked away, she glanced back, her eyes catching Celeste's for a fleeting second, a crack in her armor. Celeste stood slowly, her hand falling to her side, her face betraying a flicker of hurt before she masked it with a deep breath. The dunes seemed to sigh with her, their curves unmoved by the storm brewing among the three. Daniel's jaw tightened, his eyes following Lila. "Lila, give her a chance," he called, his voice firm but tinged with a father's hesitation. He turned to Celeste, his brow creased with worry. "I'm sorry," he said, his hand reaching for hers. "She's just adjusting." Celeste squeezed his hand, her touch grounding. "She's scared," she said softly, her eyes drifting to Lila's retreating figure. "I was too once." Her words carried the weight of memory, years of fighting to be seen, to be heard, in a world that tried to box her in. She'd faced skepticism from studio heads, whispers from gala guests, yet here she was offering a hand to a girl who saw her as a threat. The trail curved upward, leading to a ridge overlooking the retreat. Celeste paused, her gaze sweeping the oasis below, the glass facades glinting, the pool a sapphire gleam. "We're building something," she said to Daniel, her voice vibrant, with passion. "A production company, stories that matter. I want to tell the ones no one else dares to." Daniel's eyes lit up, his hand tightening around hers. "You're unstoppable," he said, his voice thick with pride. But his glance darted to Lila, now a small figure kicking sand below, and a shadow crossed his face. He wanted to bridge this divide, but the words eluded him. Caught between love and duty, Lila stopped at the base of the ridge, her camera raised as if to capture the dunes. The shutter clicked, a sharp sound in the quiet morning. Celeste watched, her eyes softening. She saw the way Lila adjusted the lens, her fingers tentative but precise, a spark of creativity buried beneath her defiance. "She's got an eye," Celeste murmured almost to herself. Daniel followed her gaze, his expression conflicted. "She's always loved that camera," he said, his voice low. "But she's shutting me out, shutting you out." Celeste nodded, her lips curving into a small, private smile. "Give her time," she said. "She'll find her way." The wind picked up, a contrary gust that stirred the sand into swirling patterns, as if the desert itself were taking sides. Celeste's hair loosened slightly, a strand dancing across her cheek. She tucked it back, her movements deliberate, her eyes fixed on Lila. She remembered her own battles, rejections from film schools, dismissive producers, the sting of being called too ambitious for a black woman from a modest home. Lila's anger was a mirror, reflecting a pain Celeste knew too well. But where Lila lashed out, Celeste had learned to endure, to carve her own path through the sand. Daniel stepped closer, his shoulder brushing hers. "You're too good to us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Celeste's eyes met, his warm but resolute. "I'm here for you," she said, and for her, whether she knows it yet or not. Her gaze drifted to Lila, who now sat cross-legged in the sand, her camera resting in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The girl's shoulders were less rigid, her defiance softened by the vastness around her. Celeste's heart tightened, not with anger, but with a quiet hope that this contrary wind might yet shift. The sun climbed higher, its light harsh but honest, casting long shadows across the dunes. Celeste took a step forward, her sneakers sinking into the sand, her presence a quiet defiance against the storm of prejudice brewing in Lila's heart. The desert watched, silent and unyielding, as the three figures stood apart yet bound, their story unfolding with each gust of wind. The theater at Sky Dune Retreat was a monument to ambition, its sleek lines and glass dome catching the desert sun like a jewel. Inside, velvet curtains framed a stage where a massive screen flickered with the trailer for Celeste Johnson's latest film, a tapestry of raw emotion and bold visuals that hushed the gathering crowd. The air buzzed with anticipation, the scent of polished wood and fresh roses mingling with the murmur of elite guests, CEOs, philanthropists, and old money, all seated in plush rows, their faces a mask of polite curiosity. The stone plaque, still veiled at the theater's entrance, loomed like a silent oracle, its hidden inscription fueling whispers about the mysterious donor who'd funded this architectural marvel. Celeste sat in the front row, her posture regal, her emerald dress a quiet statement against her deep brown skin. At 36, she was Hollywood's titan, her presence commanding even in stillness. Her hair, swept into soft waves, framed eyes that gleamed with quiet pride, though they flickered with the weight of the room's scrutiny. Beside her, Daniel Ashford, 27, rested his hand on hers, his cream suit crisp, his boyish charm tempered by a protective edge. His thumb traced her knuckles, a silent vow, but his eyes darted to the row behind where his daughter, Lila, sat with his mother, Margaret. Lila, 15, slouched in her black dress, her dark hair a curtain over her face, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her camera. Her gaze was fixed on Celeste, sharp and accusing, a storm brewing in her eyes. Margaret, in a pastel lavender gown, leaned close, murmuring about new money to a friend. Her voice low but deliberate, a needle meant to prick. The words drifted forward, catching the ear of a nearby guest, who shifted uncomfortably, her pearls glinting as she glanced at Celeste. The room was a chessboard, and every move was watched. As the lights dimmed, the MC took the stage, his voice smooth and commanding. Tonight we dedicate this theater, a vision born of one person's passion, kept secret at their request until this moment, he said, his words sparking murmurs. Guests leaned forward, speculating about a reclusive philanthropist or a corporate titan. Celeste's lips curved slightly, a private knowledge flickering in her eyes, but she kept her gaze on the screen, where her film's trailer played, a story of resilience that mirrored her own. Lila leaned toward a woman beside her, a socialite in a sequined gown, her voice a hushed venom. "She's only here because of Dad," she whispered, her words sharp enough to cut through the theater's hum. The socialite's eyes widened, then darted to Celeste, who sat unmoved, her fingers tightening briefly on Daniel's hand. A man in the next seat frowned, his brow creasing as he leaned away from Lila, his disapproval subtle but clear. The whisper spread, a ripple of judgment in the polished crowd, but Celeste's face remained serene, her eyes fixed on the screen, her silence a shield forged in years of facing rooms that questioned her place. Daniel's jaw clenched, his hand squeezing Celeste's. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice low, his eyes burning with frustration. Celeste shook her head, her smile faint but resolute. "It's nothing new," she murmured, her tone steady, but her gaze drifted to Lila, catching the girl's fleeting glance, a mix of defiance and uncertainty. Celeste knew this dance, the assumptions about her race, her success, her right to sit in the front row. She'd faced it in Hollywood studios, in gala ballrooms, in every space where her presence was a challenge to the status quo. The trailer ended, the screen fading to black, and the crowd erupted in applause, though some claps were perfunctory, tinged with envy or skepticism. The MC returned, his smile broad. "This theater stands as a testament to vision," he said, gesturing to the veiled plaque. Its donor, a figure of remarkable influence, chose anonymity to let the work speak for itself. The words hung, heavy with promise, and the crowd leaned forward, their whispers growing urgent. Margaret's lips tightened, her gloved hand resting on Lila's arm, a silent signal to stay composed. Lila's fingers fidgeted with her camera, her eyes darting to Celeste, then away, a crack in her certainty. Celeste felt the room's gaze, a weight she'd carried since her first days as a black woman in Hollywood's elite circles. She'd built her empire from nothing, nights studying film in a cramped apartment, rejections from studios that saw her as a risk, not a visionary. Yet here she was, front and center, her legacy waiting to be unveiled. Her hand rested lightly on Daniel's, her touch grounding, but her eyes were on the stage where the truth simmered, patient and unyielding. Daniel leaned close, his voice barely a whisper. "You're a force," he said, his eyes warm with admiration. Celeste's lips curved, a private smile. "Wait for it," she said, her tone laced with quiet anticipation. But her gaze flickered to Lila, who now sat rigid, her camera clutched tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Celeste saw the girl's tension, the way her shoulders hunched, and for a moment, she remembered her own youth, the sting of being underestimated, the hunger to prove herself. Lila's whispers were a child's weapon, born of fear, not malice. The MC's voice rose, drawing the crowd's attention. "The dedication is moments away," he said, his eyes sweeping the room. "This theater will redefine Sky Dune's legacy." The words sparked a fresh wave of murmurs, some guests exchanging skeptical glances, others nodding with curiosity. Margaret's friend leaned close, whispering about outsiders funding such projects, her words a veiled jab at Celeste. The socialite who'd heard Lila's whisper shifted in her seat, her expression torn between discomfort and intrigue. The room was a crucible, and Celeste stood at its heart, her presence a quiet defiance. The lights brightened, illuminating the veiled plaque. Celeste's fingers tightened on Daniel's hand, a subtle pulse of anticipation. She knew what lay beneath the velvet, the inscription that would silence the whispers if only for a moment. But her eyes drifted to Lila, whose gaze flickered up, meeting hers for a fleeting second. There was no warmth in the girl's stare, but there was something else. A question, unspoken, trembling on the edge of doubt. Celeste held her gaze, her own eyes soft but unyielding, a silent promise. "You'll see me soon." The crowd's murmur grew, the air thick with expectation. Celeste sat taller, her posture a declaration, her presence a challenge to every assumption in the room. The desert sun burned outside, its light filtering through the glass dome, casting long shadows across the theater. The whispers behind smiles swirled, but Celeste was unmoved, her legacy waiting in the wings, ready to rewrite the narrative. The private lounge at Sky Dune Retreat was a sanctuary of understated elegance, its amber lamps casting a warm glow across sleek mahogany panels and plush velvet chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the desert beyond, where dunes stretched like silent waves under a twilight sky. The air was heavy, not with the scent of roses or champagne, but with the unspoken weight of a family unraveling. Celeste Johnson stood by the window, her emerald dress catching the lamplight, her deep brown skin a striking contrast against the glass. At 36, she was a pillar of composure, her hair in soft waves, her posture unyielding, yet graceful. But her eyes, dark and piercing, betrayed a flicker of weariness as they traced the horizon, seeking solace in the desert's vastness. Daniel Ashford stood near the center of the room, his cream suit slightly rumpled, his boyish features hardened by a storm brewing within. His voice, low and taut, cut through the silence as he faced his daughter, Lila. "You can't keep doing this," he said, his hands clenched at his sides. Lila, 15, slouched against a velvet chair, her black dress creased, her camera dangling from her neck like a reluctant anchor. Her dark hair fell over her eyes, but they burned with defiance, her lips set in a stubborn line. Margaret, Daniel's mother, sat rigidly on a sofa, her lavender gown pristine, her face a mask of disapproval, her gloved hands folded tightly. In her lap, the tension had been simmering since the theater, where Lila's whisper, "She's only here because of Dad," had rippled through the crowd, a barb that stung deeper than she'd intended. Now, in this private space, the dam broke. Lila's voice rose, sharp and trembling. "She's just a director who got lucky," she spat, her eyes locked on Celeste, who remained by the window, her back to the room. "You're using him to climb the social ladder, and everyone knows it." The words were a blade, slicing through the air, raw with the fear of a girl who felt her world slipping away. Daniel's face darkened, his voice cracking like thunder. "Lila, stop this now," he snapped, his hands unclenching, trembling with a mix of anger and guilt. He took a step toward her, his eyes pleading. "You don't know her, you don't know what you're saying." Lila flinched, her fingers tightening around her camera, but her gaze didn't waver, fixed on Celeste with a mix of rage and desperation. Margaret's lips parted, as if to speak, but she remained silent, her eyes flickering with a cold approval that fueled Lila's fire. Celeste turned slowly, her movements deliberate, her eyes blazing but her voice steady as steel. "Is that what you think, Lila?" she asked, her tone calm, almost gentle, but laced with a quiet power that filled the room. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor, her presence commanding despite the venom aimed at her. "Let me tell you who I am." Her words were measured, each one a stone laid in a path she'd walked alone. "I grew up in a one-bedroom apartment, sharing a mattress with my sister. I worked nights to pay for film school, got rejected by every studio in Hollywood because they said I didn't fit the mold. I built my career from nothing. Every script, every award, every dollar. Luck had nothing to do with it." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling like dust after a storm. Lila's eyes widened, her bravado cracking, her fingers loosening on her camera. Daniel's shoulders sagged, his anger giving way to awe, his gaze fixed on Celeste. Margaret's face tightened, her gloved hands clenching, a flicker of unease breaking her composure. Celeste continued, her voice soft but unyielding. "I'm here because I love your father, Lila. Not his name, not his money. Him." She paused, her eyes locking onto Lila's, searching for the girl beneath the anger. "What scares you about me being here?" The question hung, raw and piercing, a mirror held up to Lila's soul, her lips parted, her breath catching. "You're taking him away," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't belong here." The words were fragile, not cruel, a child's fear laid bare. Celeste's face softened, a flicker of pain crossing her eyes, but she didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, grounding herself. "I'm not taking anything," she said, her voice warm, almost maternal. "I'm here to build, not to break." Daniel's eyes darted between them, his voice breaking the silence. "Lila, you're wrong," he said, his tone firm but aching. "Celeste is the best thing in my life, you need to see that." He reached for Celeste's hand, his touch a silent vow. But his glance at Lila was heavy with conflict, a father torn between love and duty. Lila's shoulders trembled, her camera slipping slightly in her grip. She opened her mouth to retort, but no words came. Instead, she turned, storming toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the quiet lounge. As she reached the threshold, her eyes flickered back to Celeste, a storm of doubt and shame in her gaze, before she disappeared into the hall. Celeste exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening briefly on the chair, her composure a shield forged. In years of facing prejudice, studio heads who'd called her too bold, gala guests who'd questioned her place, she'd fought for every inch of her empire, her blackness a badge of resilience in a world that tried to dim her light. Yet Lila's words, raw and childlike, cut deeper than she'd expected, stirring memories of her own battles against those who saw her as less. Margaret stood, her lavender gown rustling, her voice cold but measured. "She's young," she said, her eyes avoiding Celeste's. "She'll learn." The words were a dismissal, a refusal to acknowledge the rift she'd helped widen. Celeste's gaze met hers, steady and unyielding, a silent challenge that made Margaret look away, her gloved hands smoothing her skirt in a nervous gesture. Daniel stepped closer to Celeste, his hand finding hers. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice thick with admiration and guilt. Celeste's lips curved, a faint smile that held both strength and sorrow. "Yes, I did," she said, her eyes drifting to the door where Lila had vanished. The desert outside was dark now, its dunes cloaked in shadow, but the lounge's amber glow held them in a fragile moment. Celeste stood tall, her presence a testament to her truth, a name carved not just in stone but in the battles she'd won. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered, a promise of truths yet to unfold. The rooftop of Sky Dune retreat was a stage set for dreams, its marble tiles gleaming under a canopy of desert stars. Lanterns cast a warm amber glow, their light dancing across silk-draped tables, and the elegant swirl of guests in designer gowns and tailored suits. A jazz ensemble wove a sultry melody through the air, its notes mingling with the clink of crystal and the low hum of elite conversation. Beyond the balustrade, the dunes stretched into infinity, their shadows a silent audience to the drama unfolding. Above, the night was alive, but beneath its glamour, a current of tension pulsed, sharp as the desert wind. Celeste Johnson stood at the heart of the gala, her emerald gown a cascade of silk that shimmered against her deep brown skin. At 36, she was a beacon of power. Her hair swept into soft waves, her posture a quiet command that drew every eye. Her laughter, rich and deliberate, carried as she spoke with a renowned producer, her hands animated as she described her latest film, a story of defiance that mirrored her own. Her eyes, dark and piercing, scanned the crowd, not for approval but for truth, reading the masks of privilege and prejudice that hid behind polished smiles. Daniel Ashford stood nearby, his cream blazer catching the lantern light, his boyish charm tempered by a growing resolve. He watched Celeste with awe, his hand brushing hers in a fleeting gesture of pride, but his eyes darted to the corner, where his daughter, Lila, sat at a table, her black dress stark against the festive glow. Lila, 15, clutched her camera, her dark hair falling over her face, her gaze fixed on Celeste with a mix of resentment and unease. Her fingers hesitated over the lens, a flicker of doubt in her movements, as if the weight of her own words was beginning to settle. Evelyn Warwick, the waspish socialite, glided toward Lila, her silver gown glinting like a blade. Her smile was sharp, her voice a velvet barb as she leaned close. "Your father's choice is bold," she murmured, her eyes flicking to Celeste. "Not everyone fits in these circles, you know." Lila's lips twitched, her fingers tightening on her camera, Evelyn's words fanning the embers of her insecurity. She turned to a group of teens nearby, her voice low but deliberate. "She doesn't belong here," she whispered, her words carrying to a young heiress who raised an eyebrow, then glanced at Celeste. A waiter passing by caught the rumor, his brow furrowing as he adjusted his tray, his eyes lingering on Celeste with a mix of curiosity and respect. The whisper spread, a subtle poison rippling through the gala. A silver-haired tycoon frowned, murmuring to his wife about decorum, while a young actress nearby tilted her head, her expression torn between discomfort and intrigue. Celeste, mid-conversation with the producer, caught the shift in the air, her jaw tightening imperceptibly. She turned, her eyes locking onto Lila's for a fleeting moment, calm but piercing, a silent challenge that made Lila's gaze falter. Instead of retreating, Celeste raised her voice slightly, inviting the producer to join her in discussing her film's impact on underrepresented voices. Her words carried across the rooftop, clear and commanding, drawing nods from a cluster of guests who leaned closer, their murmurs turning to admiration. Daniel's eyes followed the exchange, his jaw clenching as he caught Lila's whisper. He stepped toward her, his voice low but firm. "Lila, enough," he said, his tone carrying a father's authority tempered by worry. Lila's shoulders stiffened, her fingers hesitating over her camera, her eyes darting to Celeste, then away. The doubt in her gaze was new, a crack in her defiance, as if Celeste's unshakable presence was beginning to unsettle her. Daniel turned back to Celeste, his hand finding hers, his touch a silent apology. "You're incredible," he whispered, his voice thick with pride, but his glance at Lila was heavy with conflict. Celeste squeezed his hand, her smile faint but resolute. "I've heard worse," she said, her tone light but laced with steel. Her eyes drifted to Lila, who now sat alone, her friends distracted by the dance floor. Lila's fingers traced the edge of her camera, her gaze fixed on the stars, a flicker of uncertainty in her posture. Celeste knew this game. The whispers, the assumptions, the weight of being a black woman in spaces built to exclude her. She'd faced producers who'd dismissed her vision, critics who'd questioned her rise. Yet here she was, commanding a rooftop of elites with a single sentence. The jazz ensemble shifted to a slower tempo, its notes wrapping the gala in a dreamy haze. Guests swayed on the dance floor, their laughter a veneer over the tension. Evelyn returned to her circle, her smile tight as she whispered to a friend, her eyes flicking to Celeste with a mix of envy and disdain. Margaret, standing near the balustrade, watched in silence, her lavender gown catching the lantern light, her gloved hands folded tightly. Her face was a mask, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as Celeste's voice drew more attention, her influence undeniable. Celeste moved through the crowd, her steps fluid, her presence a quiet defiance. She paused to speak with a young director, her words vibrant as she shared her vision for stories that broke barriers. The director nodded, his eyes bright with respect, and a small crowd gathered, their murmurs shifting from skepticism to curiosity. Lila watched from her table, her fingers still on her camera, her gaze flickering between Celeste and the stars. For a moment she raised the lens as if to capture the scene, but lowered it, her hands trembling slightly, her doubt a silent storm. The desert wind stirred, carrying a faint chill across the rooftop. Celeste's gown rippled, her hair catching the breeze, a strand dancing across her cheek. She tucked it back, her movements deliberate, her eyes sweeping the crowd. She saw the whispers, the glances, the subtle barbs, but she also saw the nods, the leaning figures, the shifting tide of respect. She was the one they mocked, the one they underestimated, but she was also the one they owed, a truth waiting to be unveiled. Daniel stepped closer, his shoulder brushing hers. "You're changing the room," he said, his voice low, his eyes warm with admiration. Celeste's lips curved, a private smile. "I'm just being me," she said, her tone soft but unyielding. Her gaze drifted to Lila, whose eyes met hers for a fleeting second, a question trembling in their depths. The stars above burned bright, but the real light was Celeste standing tall, her legacy a quiet fire ready to ignite. The theater at Sky Dune Retreat was a cathedral of ambition, its glass dome refracting the desert sun into a kaleidoscope of light that bathed the velvet-draped stage. Rows of plush seats cradled an elite audience, moguls, philanthropists, and heirs, whose murmurs filled the air like a restless tide. The scent of polished oak and fresh orchids clung to the space, but beneath the elegance a current of expectation crackled, sharp as a desert storm. At the theater's entrance, a stone plaque stood unveiled, its inscription hidden beneath a crimson curtain, a secret that had fueled whispers for days. The crowd leaned forward, their eyes darting between the stage and the plaque, hungry for the truth about the mysterious donor who'd birthed this monument. Celeste Johnson sat in the front row, her emerald dress a quiet blaze against her deep brown skin. At 36, she was a vision of unshakable poise, her hair swept into soft waves, her posture regal yet relaxed. Her eyes, dark and luminous, held a private pride, though they flickered with the weight of the room's scrutiny. Beside her, Daniel, Ashford 27, rested his hand on hers, his cream suit pristine, his boyish charm hardened by a fierce loyalty. His thumb traced her knuckles, a silent anchor, but his gaze drifted to the row behind where his daughter Lila sat with his mother Margaret. Lila, 15, clutched her camera, her black dress stark against the theater's opulence, her dark hair falling over her eyes. Her gaze was fixed on Celeste, a storm of resentment and doubt swirling within, though her fingers trembled slightly, betraying a crack in her defiance. Margaret, in a lavender gown, sat rigidly, her gloved hands folded, her face a mask of composure that barely concealed her unease. Her eyes flicked to Celeste, then away, as if the younger woman's presence was a challenge she couldn't meet. The MC took the stage, his voice resonant, cutting through the crowd's murmur. "This theater is a testament to vision," he said, his gesture sweeping toward the veiled plaque. Its donor, a figure of extraordinary influence, requested anonymity until this moment, insisting the work speak for itself. The words sparked a ripple of gasps, Guests exchanging glances, some curious, others skeptical. A silver-haired tycoon whispered to his wife about corporate backing, while Evelyn Warwick, the waspish socialite, leaned toward a friend, her silver gown glinting as she murmured about outsiders. The crowd was a chessboard, and Celeste was its unspoken queen, her presence a silent dare. Celeste's fingers tightened briefly on Daniel's hand, a pulse of anticipation. She knew what lay beneath the curtain, the inscription that would rewrite the room's narrative. Her eyes remained on the stage, her composure a shield forged in years of battling prejudice, from studio rejections to gala whispers. As a black woman who'd risen from a modest upbringing to Hollywood's elite, she'd learned to carry her truth like armor, letting it shine when the moment was right. The MC's voice rose, his smile broadening. Ladies and gentlemen, the Celeste Johnson Theater. The curtain fell, revealing the plaque's bold inscription, Celeste Johnson Theater, dedicated to dreamers who defy. The room erupted in gasps, a tidal wave of shock and awe. Celeste stood, her movements deliberate, her emerald dress catching, the light like a flame. Her eyes blazed with pride, her chin lifting slightly, a quiet triumph radiating from her core. The crowd's applause swelled, though some hands clapped reluctantly. Evelyn's tight smile betrayed her envy, and the tycoon's wife raised an eyebrow, her nod grudging. Lila's jaw dropped, her camera slipping in her grip, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her hands trembled, the weight of her whispers. She doesn't belong here, crashing against the truth carved in stone. Margaret's face paled, her gloved fingers clutching her purse, her composure fracturing as she stared at the plaque. The air was thick, the revelation a blade that cut through every assumption, every barb, every glance that had tried to diminish Celeste. Daniel beamed, his hand finding Celeste's, his voice booming as he stepped forward. "This is her vision," he said, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "Celeste built this, and I'm damn proud to stand with her." His words were a gauntlet, a defiance of the elite's skepticism, and the applause grew louder. Though a few guests, like Evelyn, exchanged skeptical glances, Celeste's lips curved, a private smile for Daniel, but her gaze drifted to Lila, whose eyes were locked on the plaque, her breath shallow, her defiance crumbling under the weight of truth. The MC invited Celeste to the stage, and she ascended, with a grace that silenced the room. Her heels clicked softly, each step a reclamation, her presence a testament to her journey. "This theater is for those who dare," she said, her voice clear, resonant, carrying the cadence of someone who'd fought for every word, for those who face closed doors and build their own. Her eyes swept the crowd, lingering on Lila for a fleeting moment, soft but unyielding, a silent invitation to see beyond prejudice. Lila's shoulders trembled, her camera now resting. In her lap, her gaze fixed on Celeste. The girl's eyes glistened, a storm of shame and awe swirling within. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and bolted for the exit, her footsteps echoing in the hushed theater. The crowd stirred, a few guests whispering, but Celeste's composure held, her eyes following Lila's empty seat with a trace of sadness. She knew this pain, the shock of being wrong, the weight of facing one's own flaws. Margaret's fingers tightened on her purse, her face a mask of conflict. She leaned toward her friend, her voice low. "She kept that quiet," she murmured, her tone laced with begrudging respect. But her eyes avoided Celeste, a silent admission of her misjudgment. The crowd's applause faded, replaced by a hum of conversation, some praising Celeste's vision, others questioning how a newcomer could wield such influence. The theater was hers, but the battle for acceptance was far from won. Daniel stepped closer to Celeste as she descended the stage, his hand on her lower back. "You're unstoppable," he whispered, his eyes warm with love. Celeste's smile was faint, her gaze drifting to the plaque. "I just did what I had to," she said, her voice soft but resolute. Her eyes flickered to the exit, where Lila had vanished, a quiet hope stirring within. She'd built this theater not for applause, but for dreamers like Lila, who might one day see beyond the shadows of fear. The desert sun dipped below the horizon, its last rays filtering through the glass dome, casting long shadows across the theater. Celeste stood tall, her presence a defiance of every whisper, every doubt. She was the one they'd mocked, the one they'd underestimated, but now her name was carved in stone, a legacy that no one could erase. Dawn broke over the desert, painting the dunes in hues of pink and gold, their curves glowing like the embers of a quiet fire. The air was crisp, carrying the faint tang of sagebrush, a whisper of the wild that stirred the silence. At a secluded overlook, a wooden bench faced the vast expanse, its weathered grain a humble contrast to the opulence of Sky Dune retreat shimmering. The distance. Celeste Johnson sat alone, her sketchbook open in her lap, her pencil tracing the dunes' sinuous lines with a deliberate grace. At 36, she was a vision of strength, her deep brown skin radiant in the morning light, her hair pulled into a loose bun, strands dancing in the gentle breeze. Her eyes, dark and contemplative, held a quiet resolve, as if the desert itself were her confidant. The crunch of sand broke her reverie, and she glanced up to see Lila Ashford approaching, her steps hesitant, her camera dangling from her neck, like a fragile lifeline. At 15, Lila was a storm of contradictions, her black hoodie stark against the dawn, her dark hair falling over her eyes, her posture torn between defiance and vulnerability. Her hands fidgeted, her gaze fixed on the ground, but her presence was a seismic shift, a girl standing at the edge of reckoning. Celeste closed her sketchbook, her movements slow, her eyes soft but searching, inviting Lila to speak. Lila stopped. Few feet away, her voice shaky, barely above a whisper. "I saw your name on the plaque," she said, her eyes flickering up to meet Celeste's, then dropping again. "And I looked you up. Your awards, your films, how you started with nothing." Her fingers tightened on her camera, her breath catching. "I was wrong about you, about everything." The words trembled, raw and halting, a confession carved from shame. Celeste's face remained unreadable, but her eyes softened, a warmth breaking through her guarded calm. Lila's voice grew steadier, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I thought you were taking Dad away," she admitted, her gaze drifting to the dunes. "And I didn't want a black woman, someone older, to be part of us. I'm sorry." The apology was a wound laid bare, a child's prejudice exposed to the desert's unyielding truth. Celeste's breath caught, a flicker of pain crossing her face, but she leaned forward, her hands resting on her sketchbook, grounding herself. She knew this pain, the sting of being judged for her skin, her success, her audacity to exist in spaces not built for her. "I've been where you are," Celeste said, her voice warm, steady, carrying the cadence of someone who'd fought, and won. "I faced doors slammed shut because I was black, because I was a woman, because I dared to dream bigger than they allowed. Hollywood didn't want me at first. Producers called me too risky. Critics said I'd fail. But I kept going because my story mattered." Her eyes locked onto Lila's, soft but unyielding, a bridge built from shared struggle. "You're not your mistakes, Lila. You're what you do next." Lila's shoulders trembled, her camera slipping slightly in her grip. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small photo, a shot of the dunes from the morning walk, its light and shadow framed with a tentative artistry. "I took this," she said, her voice cracking. "After you offered to teach me, I kept thinking about it." She held the photo out, a fragile offering, her eyes searching Celeste's for forgiveness. Celeste took it, her fingers brushing Lila's, her gaze softening as she studied the image. "You've got an eye," she said, her tone vibrant with sincerity. "Let me show you how to sharpen it. Your dad thinks you'd be great at it." Lila's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise breaking through her shame. "Dad said that?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Celeste nodded, her smile faint but warm. "He told me last night to give you space, but to be here when you were ready." The words were a revelation, a quiet testament to Daniel Ashford's unseen hand in this moment. At 27, Daniel had been torn between love and duty, his boyish charm masking a growing resolve. His encouragement, shared in the shadows of the previous night, had nudged Lila toward this cliff of courage, a father finding his voice through faith in his daughter's heart. The desert wind stirred, a gentle gust that lifted strands of Celeste's hair, her emerald scarf rippling like a banner. She set the photo on her sketchbook, her hands folding over it, a silent acceptance of Lila's apology. "Photography's about seeing truth," she said, her eyes meeting Lila's, a spark of mentorship igniting. "You're starting to see it. Keep going." Lila's lips curved, a tentative smile breaking through her tears, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. She nodded, clutching her camera, a lifeline now forged in hope. The sun climbed higher, its light harsh, but honest, casting long shadows across the dunes. Celeste stood, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, her presence a quiet defiance against the prejudice that had tried to dim her. Lila stepped closer, her sneakers sinking into the sand, her gaze no longer fleeing Celeste's. The overlook was a crucible, where shame had burned away, leaving a fragile bond in its ashes. Celeste's heart tightened, not with triumph, but with a recognition of growth, a girl stepping out of fear's shadow. In the distance, Sky Dune retreat shimmered, its glass walls a mirage of wealth and power. Daniel was there waiting, his faith in both women a silent force that had shaped this moment. He'd found his voice not in confrontation, but in trust, in knowing when to step back and let truth speak. Celeste's eyes drifted to the horizon, where the dunes met the sky, a canvas of possibility. She saw Lila's photo in her mind's eye, light and shadow, raw and unpolished, a story waiting to be told. The two women stood side by side, their silhouettes small against the desert's vastness. Lila raised her camera, framing the dunes, her shutter clicking with a newfound purpose. Celeste watched, her smile deepening, a quiet vow forming within, to guide, to build, to see this girl become more than her mistakes. The desert bore witness, silence a canvas for their shared beginning, a legacy unfolding with each step they took. The final gala at Sky Dune Retreat was a tapestry of splendor, its rooftop transformed into a celestial stage beneath a desert sky ablaze with stars. Marble tiles gleamed under the glow of lanterns, their amber light weaving through silk-draped tables and the elegant swirl of guests in resplendent gowns and tailored suits. A jazz ensemble played a vibrant melody, its notes soaring like sparks, mingling with the clink of crystal and the hum of elite conversation. Beyond the balustrade, the dunes lay silent, their shadows a timeless witness to the drama unfolding. Above, in the distance, the Celeste Johnson Theater's plaque glinted, its inscription a quiet testament to a truth that had reshaped the retreat's narrative. Celeste Johnson stood at the gala's heart, her gold gown a radiant cascade against her deep brown skin, its shimmer catching the starlight like a beacon. At 36, she was a pillar of grace and power, her hair swept into an elegant updo, her posture commanding yet warm. Her eyes, dark and luminous, held a quiet triumph, scanning the crowd with a wisdom forged in battles won. Beside her, Daniel Ashford, 27, stood tall in a charcoal suit, his boyish charm now tempered by a steely resolve. His hand rested lightly on hers, his thumb brushing her knuckles, a silent vow of unwavering loyalty. Across the rooftop, Lila Ashford, 15, hovered near a table, her black dress softened by a silver scarf, her camera dangling from her neck. Her dark hair was pulled back, revealing eyes that flickered with nervous determination. Her fingers toyed with the camera's strap, a lifeline to the courage she'd found at Dawn's overlook. Margaret, Daniel's mother, stood at the crowd's edge, her lavender gown pristine, her face a mask of restraint, her gloved hands clenched tightly, her eyes avoiding Celeste, a silent acknowledgement of her diminished influence. The MC took the stage, his voice cutting through the gala's hum. Tonight we celebrate the Celeste Johnson Theater and the visionary who made it possible, he said, gesturing to the plaque's distant glow. The crowd applauded, though some hands clapped reluctantly. Evelyn Warwick's silver gown glinted. As she offered a tight smile, her eyes sharp with envy. Daniel stepped forward, unprompted, his presence commanding the stage. The jazz ensemble paused, the air growing taut with anticipation. Celeste Johnson is not just a name on a plaque, Daniel began, his voice clear, resonant, slicing through the desert night. She's a force who faced prejudice, whispers, doubts, assumptions about her race, her success, and built an empire anyway. I've watched her endure, and I'm done staying silent. His eyes swept the crowd, lingering on Evelyn, on Margaret, a gauntlet thrown. She's the heart of this retreat, and I'm proud to stand with her. His hand reached for Celeste's, pulling her to his side, his gaze warm but fierce. The crowd stirred, murmurs rippling, some nodding in respect, others shifting uncomfortably. Celeste's lips curved, a private smile for Daniel, but her eyes flickered with gratitude, a quiet recognition of his growth. She stood taller, her gold gown shimmering, her presence a defiance of every barb that had tried to dim her. The applause swelled, though Evelyn's clap was perfunctory, her lips pursed. A silver-haired tycoon leaned toward his wife, murmuring skepticism, but a young actress nearby clapped fiercely, her eyes bright with admiration. The room was a crucible, its reactions a mirror of the world's complexities. Daniel turned to Lila, his voice softening. My daughter's learned something. This week, he said, his eyes meeting hers across the rooftop. Lila, come up. Lila froze, her fingers tightening on her camera, her breath catching. The crowd's gaze shifted, a weight she felt like a physical force. She stepped forward, her sneakers silent on the marble, her eyes darting to Celeste. Then to her father. Her voice trembled as she took the stage, her words halting but sincere. I was wrong about Celeste, she said, her gaze flickering to the crowd, then settling on Celeste. I judged her, said things I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. Her voice cracked, raw with vulnerability, a girl bearing her soul before the elite. Celeste's eyes softened, a warmth breaking through her composure. She stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on Lila's shoulder, a gesture both maternal and equal. No need to call me Mom, she said, her voice warm, carrying across the silent gala. Just call me by name. The words were a bridge, a promise of trust yet to be built. Lila's lips curved, a tentative smile, her eyes glistening with relief. The crowd applauded, a wave of sound that carried respect, though Evelyn's hands barely moved, her face tight with disdain. Celeste took the microphone, her presence commanding the stage. This theater is for dreamers, she said, her voice resonant, weaving a spell over the gala. For those who face prejudice, race, class, gender, and dare to rise, I built it because my story, your stories matter. Her eyes swept the crowd, lingering on Lila, on Daniel, a silent vow to keep building. The applause roared, though a few guests like the tycoon clapped reluctantly, their skepticism a stubborn shadow. Margaret turned away, her lavender gown rustling, her face conflicted as she retreated to the balustrade, her silence a concession to Celeste's triumph. The jazz ensemble resumed, its melody soaring, pulling guests to the dance floor. Daniel's hand found Celeste's, his eyes warm with love. You changed everything, he whispered, his voice thick with pride. Celeste's smile deepened, her gaze drifting to Lila, who now stood nearby, her camera raised, capturing the moment. We all did, she said, her tone soft but resolute. Lila's shutter clicked, her eyes meeting Celeste's, a spark of trust igniting. The desert stars burned above, their light unyielding, a canvas for a new family forged in truth. Celeste, Daniel, and Lila stood together, their silhouettes a quiet defiance against the whispers that had tried to tear them apart. The gala swirled around them, its glamour a fleeting veil over the legacy they'd built. Margaret's retreat, Evelyn's silence, the crowd's mixed applause, they were ripples in a tide that Celeste had turned, her name a beacon for those who dared to dream. As the desert stars fade over Sky Dune retreat, Celeste's legacy shines, a testament to courage, truth, and the power to rise above prejudice. What did this journey stir in you? Did Lila's transformation resonate? Or was it Celeste's unyielding grace that left its mark? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your voice. Thank you for joining us in this tale of defiance and redemption. Your support lights our path forward. Until next time, keep dreaming boldly, and we'll meet again under new skies.